Hello, and welcome to Varn. And today I'm going to tie two threads together that come up a lot in my work that I haven't tied together because they're not always related to the political economic stuff or the historical things we talk about on this channel. One is my critique of emotivism. Now, emotivism does not mean that you separate the passions from reason. And in fact, if you follow through the logical positivist and the pragmatist formulations of emotivist logic, which I'm going to do in various solos, I'm writing one right now that goes into the history of the American end of this. You see that emotivism was an attempt to just say that morality was aesthetic and was non-cognitive and thus not really a part of reasoning at all. Yes, the Humean slave of the passions and all that was its own thing, but the idea of a complete reasoning, including the affective and the cognitive, all right, thinking and feeling, because in reality, they're not that different in your brain, um, was always important. What guides your action, what principles and what motivations, and then what are the constraining factors on your principles. It is not good enough to have morality if your morality leads you to wish for things that cannot happen. And this brings me to pessimism. Now, the pessimism optimism binary is a false binary. I've been accused of honing to it. Why I insist so much on using the word, however, is that I am actively negating optimism about things that we have currently tried and continue to do as if our will make them happen on their own. Things go the way they go, not just because people have ideas, but because those ideas are incentivized in the material world. Those material incentives reward certain ideas and not others. Now, there are multiple pathways to respond to these incentives. You are never totally determined towards one thing. You know, that's the rational core of the David Graeber and David Wingrove book, The Dawn of Everything. But what they leave out is that you are more incentivized in specific conditions, geographic, economic, social reproduction, sexual, etc. But your principles actually do guide how you interpret and parse those conditions, which is why you can never fully collapse descriptions and norms, values and facts, nor can you fully separate them. Reality doesn't care about your emotions, says Ben Shapiro, one of the most sentimental saps I've ever seen to pretend to be a rationalist. Nonetheless, reality doesn't care because reality doesn't care about anything. It doesn't have that kind of agency. The point here is a simple one. You must admit where you are and how things developed and go back to your first principles and your first analytics. If those analytics are wrong, if they cannot help you, you do have to drop them and you have to admit it. There's an eclectic way that academics often try to combine these things without realizing that their paradigms are fundamentally contradictory, that they're inconsistent, that you can't believe A and kumquat. All right? Because they're from separate systems. You can't believe in modern monetary theory and crisis theory as classically articulated unless there is a third thing which reconciles the two. This is why emotivism and hyperrationalism both will not help you. You reason from premises. Your premises are never neutral, they're never unbiased, they're always located in a standpoint. All right. They are relative in that sense to your point in time and point in history. But they are not totally relative. Nor does your standpoint mean that you necessarily have any objective truth of the structure of things because of your standpoint in it. You have qualia. You understand the quality or experience of that. The collapsing of these things is done by both the emotivist activist and the hyper rationalist. They both do it on different sides, maybe, but nonetheless, they do. To revitalize the workers' movement, you have to look at where the workers' movement is at. You have to admit certain things to yourself. The most unionized jobs are in the areas that are already progressive. You live in a federal republic. If you want to move things electorally through mass labor, you cannot pretend that the 15% of the population that is in the combined sectors of logistics and industrial production can make up for the entire population. The vast majority of people in the wage relation are service sector workers. If you have a fetish for productivity based off of a reading of Marx, where Marx does not say that productivity is the only thing that generates the proletariat, as logistics workers are not directly productive, but they are necessary, then you have a problem. Nor is victimhood ever enough to motivate people. And in fact, relying on it solely can be demotivating. So you might go, well, Varn, you're a pessimist. Yeah, but I don't tell people that they're victims. They're agents and actors whose agency is multiplied by acting together. You cannot seize the world by yourself. Humans do not do that. We are social animals at our biological base. We go crazy when we are isolated, more often than not. That is why isolation is a form of torture. But we can, working together, change the aggregate outcome if we acknowledge our limitations to do so. Meaning, there are constraints on what we can do. But my friends, we waste more food than we need to. We could feed most of the starving people. Actually, we could feed all of the starving people off of food waste alone. We could house everyone and reduce our net energy usage. Yes, you probably couldn't have the consumerist way of life you have now, but you probably also wouldn't want it. Have you noticed things are made of cheaper and cheaper materials, more and more disposable because it keeps you in a market cycle? It's not planned obsolescence, it's self proof of some of the problems of profitability. If you make too good of a product, people will not need to rebuy it. But we know how to make it, yet we don't. The deeper condition here is, can your principles and reality mesh? Is there an emergent and interrelational quality to that? Can you fight oligarchy and decomplexify your workforce, which would reduce class needs? Can you produce what you need and reduce labor time and work weeks? You absolutely could. We are now well beyond the capacity that we would have needed to do that in the beginning of the 20th century. In the first round of battle, for the most part, the good guys have lost. Furthermore, in the developing world, where people often are unexperienced, there is imagined a huge raft of industrial proletariat. But the automation shrinking of the need for the workforce, because it shrinks socially necessary labor time, also means fundamentally that there's less people employed in the developing world too. And if Philip Neal is correct, then they're also more concentrated in smaller geographic locales because of the efficiency of logistics. This means that your old tactics cannot work. You must start thinking about social reproduction. You must start thinking about the race relation as a whole instead of flailing around looking for some new political subject, or frankly, pretending that there is a majority socialist industrial working class just secretly hanging out somewhere, or that you can have a peasants people's war in a world that is largely denuded of peasants, except for some very particular areas. These are facts. Both the agricultural and industrial sector is shrinking in its needs for labor. And if we weren't making all this for a profit, that would be an objectively good thing. But under current conditions, it means larger masses of people who are rendered potentially surplus. We might not like that category. There is a Malthusian calculus within it, but it need not be that way. So yes, I am pessimistic about continuing traditions and things from the early 20th century because we do not live in that world. Our world resembles as much the 19th century as it does the 20th in its relations of production. And it resembles the ancient world, maybe even the pre-modern world, in the relative leveling of most of the population. That is why the incredible amounts of inequality that exist today, despite relative prosperity, seem to sting so much more. To have hope, you must look at things as you are. And if that requires the shock to get you to do that, to quit giving into the habitus of left things from prior periods just because we've done them in the past. Yes, it is true that even Marx talks about how all this comes from the banner of the past. When something reemerges, when some political force that would bring about what we might call socialism would emerge, it probably will be unrecognizable to all of us. Just as the people fighting the English Civil War were LARPing the Bible, and the people in France were LARPing the Roman Republic. But there is a point where you must admit that you cannot do the exact same thing. And there are material limits to what you do. And we can use those words to hide stuff, or we can throw ideological labels around to hide stuff. Increasingly, you will hear me ask people to explain the mechanism by which they think something does something. So when we complain about liberalism, do we mean the way it affects our production? Do we mean the way it trains education? Do we mean its cultural hegemony? And what are the specific mechanisms of which that works? We must understand that. Things can change and not get any better. Many things that people see as bringing about what they want are almost an eschatological hope that believing that something will go your way means that it will. There are no easy answers. There are no royal roads. Which means your passion and your analysis, your reason need to be wedded together. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. But they need to be equally weighted. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. I have a lot to say. There'll be more going into the history of emotivism, and I'm going to be doing a lot more discussions about what we mean by being pessimistic or tragic and what we don't mean. Because I do not mean fatalism. I do not mean a determinism which says that everything will always be the way it is and there is no way to change it. Which, by the way, is what hard determinism implies. You're just an optimistic hard determinist or a pessimistic one. And my friends, the evidence cuts both ways. We neither live in Steven Pinker's world, nor do we yet live in the world of common ruin, but we can all see it's possible on the horizon. Perhaps we focus too much on catastrophic thinking in a way that gets us out of doing anything. But it is good to realize that catastrophe is very possible. Thank you, and have a good day.